Hello and welcome to My Security TV. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director with My Security Media. And welcome to our Tech and Sec Weekly, our Tuesday edition. Normally we do Tuesday mornings, but we try to have some US guests on, and we still may yet have one. Let me just double check the live streams. We should be going live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and on Facebook. And it looks like someone's watching, so obviously it should be working, and I'll just assume that it is. For our today's episode, we're going to be looking at the US Indo-Pacific Strategy. The US has released their strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific, and I'm going to be talking to Professor John Blaxland, Strategic and Defence Studies with the Australian National University, and it's great to have John on again. We spoke to him just as the pandemic was unfolding last year. As we do on My Security TV, we cover aerospace and space, defence and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. We will be going for around about 45 to 60 minutes. We may have a guest from Washington on shortly, and he'll take us up to the hour, I'm sure. And as I mentioned, this is recorded and it's a live stream. So you can check us out on the Asia Pacific Security Magazine Facebook page. Otherwise, it's our YouTube channel for My Security Media, or also on my Chris Cubbage LinkedIn account on LinkedIn. Just on Friday, this is the edited version, is now available also as a podcast, but it's also on the YouTube channel. We had a few issues with our link to New York, but Ron Quaranta, the Chairman and CEO with the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance, and Dustin Brewer, the principal futurist with ISARC, and we dived into the blockchain framework and guidance. As Ron mentioned, if you're not looking at blockchain in terms of a governance model for a large enterprise, you may well be falling behind in 2021. If you are watching, we've got a few viewers now, and I'll open up the chat. So as we are covering on US strategy and the impacts on Australia and the region, you're welcome to say hello from wherever you are in the world, and also pose any questions or comments, and I'll moderate that. Also today, we're going to hear from Philippe Odouard, the Managing Director for XTEK Limited. XTEK's just signed a memorandum of understanding with a leading European robotic manufacturer, Milram Robotics. So we're going to get an update on the applications and the platforms for these unmanned ground vehicles, or UGVs, and their integrations with some drone technology as well. So looking forward to having Philippe on. Okay, so that's enough from us. Otherwise, you can check out what's going on the marketplace. There is a cybersecurity masterclass on today as well, if you're interested in that. So let's bring Professor John Blaxland from the Australian National University. Here you are, John. John, great to have you back.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be on the program.
Pleasure. And you're in Canberra, so we're in the same time zone. John, I'm going to just flip over to the next slide, and I won't highlight it, but the United States Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific was released. This was a protected document, and I think would have been in protection for about 30 years. So they've released it about 30 years beforehand. And obviously this goes with a sort of a 2-page statement from Robert O'Brien, who is the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. So this has only been out for a week or so. There's been a lot of commentary. And yeah, just your initial take on the strategy itself, and really the release of it so early, and as we're coming into an administration change in the US.
Thanks, Chris. Look, the Indo-Pacific strategy, actually, I can see why it's been declassified, because it's not really all that surprising or all that controversial. The things that are there are things that are pretty much on the public record already. So there's pundits who've been looking at this for the last couple of years can see all of the strands there. They've been manifest in various public releases and various policy announcements and so on. What is interesting is, of course, the timing of the release of this, a week or so before the handover to the new president, Joe Biden. And it strikes me it's a bit of an attempt by the outgoing Trump administration to demonstrate that they have actually had a game plan, and that what has, from outsiders' perspective, looked like a bit of a a bit of a schmozzle, where we've gone from viewing Xi Jinping as our best friend and making overtures and talking lovey-dovey with Kim Jong-un, to all of a sudden doing enormous backflips on these issues, and walking away from Trans-Pacific partnerships and things like that. That would give you that. If you looked at those policies, those actions on their own, you'd think the United States is all over the shop. This is an attempt to, I think, put on the record the United States attempt to follow this a bit of a strategy, but also I think it points to General McMaster's attempt to outline a plan, which at the time President Trump signed up to, for engagement in the region in a way that was going to assert America's claim, assert America's position, and to challenge China's attempts to roll back American influence in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly in East Asia.
So do you think it's there to strengthen the Trump administration, to say that we had one, or do you think it's to make sure that the transition to the Biden administration is that we are following a plan and we'll be following this kind of more closely? Is it sort of, which one is it going for? Is it sort of getting the region ready for Biden, or is it to say it's sort of a last statement from the Trump administration to say, hey, we were following something?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, Chris, because my sense is that in the Trump administration, particularly in the part of the Republican Party that's been very supportive of Trump, there is a real sense that Biden is going to go soft on Beijing. Biden is going to walk back from the more strong-willed, more strongly worded positions of the Trump administration. And this, I think, is part of the plan to lock in the Biden administration to the Trump-like agenda. And we've seen this in the last few days with Mike Pompeo over announcements about his State Department under Pompeo and the Trump administration calling for closer ties with Taiwan, greater recognition of Taiwan, greater diplomatic status for Taiwan. These are all a red rag to a bull for the Chinese, of course. And the fact that Pompeo is doing this days out from the inauguration of the Biden administration, it just seems to fit in with that line of reasoning that this is actually a Trump administration move to lock in what they see as spineless Biden acolytes looking to go soft on China.
So it really was a little bit of a in-your-face attempt to undermine a little bit for that administration change, which is, it's a shame to see. Again, it undermines the how the US can be sometimes, and has been under the Trump administration. Maybe what I was going to maybe break it down, and we do have someone saying hello. So g'day, Nicholas. The Quad came up quite a bit in this as well, particularly India. And I've got some sort of analysis, a Twitter feed from Zach Cooper with the American Enterprise Institute. And Zach may well sign in from Washington within the hour. And Zach, g'day if you're listening, but come on when you can. Zach broke it down quite nicely in a range of different areas. One was the strategy aims to maintain US strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific. And he asks, is primacy realistic or sensible? And we just released an opinion piece from the Beaster Institute today on Biden's sort of approach to the Indo-Pacific, and whether sort of the long game between US and China, is the US even going to have a go? Like, this is going to be a long, long play, very drawn out, very expensive. Is it worth it? And can the US maintain primacy in the region, or is it better to take a sort of a step back, and that sort of First Islands approach, as they've done strategically as well? What are your thoughts on that, and where you see this going?
Yeah, good question. Look, the question then is, what are we defining as primacy? Are we talking about out to the island, First Island chain? I mean, clearly the United States doesn't have primacy over mainland China.
Yep.
It does have primacy over the allied states, with the Republic of Korea, with Japan. It's got considerable influence in mainland Southeast Asia still, particularly in Vietnam and Thailand, less so in Cambodia and Laos. But, the rest of Southeast Asia is looking on. And despite what pundits might say, all of these countries want the United States to remain actively engaged. None of them want them to go away.
Yep.
None of them want to go away because they know that they are dealing with the CCP under President Xi, which is very much about not seeing states as equal, but as seeing them as subservient, as being of a lesser status that need to show respect and need to essentially bow the knee, bend the knee, I should say, to bow over to and acknowledge China's primacy. Now that is something that no one really wants to do. People will give lip service to engagement with China. Very interesting to see what's happening in countries like Thailand, reminiscent of the policy that was in place prior to the mid-19th century when Thailand last stopped, paying lip service to China's dominance. So there's a real question here about what this means. And of course, when we talk about primacy, we're really talking about the first island chain. And so there's a question here about, well, okay, how much do we give? Now, pundits have argued for a while, we should back down and give them the South China Sea. 10 years ago, this was one of the arguments that Hugh White made in China Choice, to let them have the South China Sea. Of course, well, they've now got most of the South China Sea, and that doesn't seem to have placated them very much at all. If anything, it's the way that's been handled, the way that the ground's been conceded, or the water has been conceded, or the shoals have been conceded, effectively without really challenging them, yep, has arguably has egged them on. And so we're now in a position where we're seeing challenges over Taiwan coming to the fore. The big question now is what's happening to Taiwan. And of course, a lot of pundits out there, my colleague Brendan Taylor has written an excellent study on the situation of Taiwan and how over time the Taiwanese position is really weakening because China's investing enormously in offensive military capabilities, yep, that are designed to either physically intimidate or take over Taiwan. But this gets to the issue of the first island chain. So what is primacy? Is it about maintaining its position in the first island chain? I think that's what it is. And from that point of view, no one wants the United States, except of course China, nobody wants the United States to stop having that primacy.
And the other one, I suppose, is the Quad on how that works, because if China was to sort of move into Taiwan, they've said they're going to, and will do so eventually. The way I read this strategy, it definitely does bring in the Quad quite strongly. That the US is kind of saying, look, we can't do it on our own, and we definitely sort of bringing in India more to the play.
Mm.
How does that change? What's your views on the Quad and how that's been somewhat more militarized than it has traditionally? It started off as a dialogue, and we spoke to Jeff Raby, the former Australian ambassador to China, and he's kind of hasn't agreed with the Quad and why Australia is in the Quad, whereas we are now locked in, and this strategy obviously does bring that to the fore. And the other thing that Robert O'Brien raises is the frameworks for the Indo-Pacific. Japan, India, even Germany and France now have Indo-Pacific frameworks. So really the sort of the allies have all now stated their place on the Indo-Pacific. And there's a bit of pushback, say, on the likes of, say, Vietnam, the Quad +1 and plus others. What's your view on the Quad and where that's developing and how central that is likely to become and how that might have aligned to this strategy as well?
So the Quad is important to Australia. I disagree with Jeff Raby there. I think it is important. And it's important in part because of what China's been doing to us. This is a reaction to China's assertiveness, its sharp power diplomacy, its wolf warrior diplomacy, I should say, and its use of sharp power. And the very fact that India is interested in playing in this quadrilateral arrangement speaks volumes to how counterproductive China's assertiveness has been. You think about the actions in the line of actual control in the Himalayas, how that has turned India against China. Now, there are the pundits who would argue that's a temporary thing, much like 1961-62, to, they'll go back to wanting to be non-aligned. But the dynamics, I think, have shifted, and they've shifted also for countries like Japan. Japan, which for a long time was very happy to play very much a second fiddle to the United States, is now much more nervous about what will happen if the United States does make more concessions, much like the Obama administration effectively made concessions over Scarborough Shoal, that then led to a series of arguably triggered the construction of an industrial scale island building in the South China Sea, because the Chinese knew that there was no one going to stop them. So Japan's looking on and thinking, is the United States going to go soft on Taiwan? There's the rhetoric from Pompeo the last few days, which is just he's trying to shore up that position. Of course, for Japan, Taiwan is more than just a quaint historical part of their former empire. It's actually fundamentally geostrategically significant in terms of its own defense, because if China captures Taiwan, seizes Taiwan, incorporates Taiwan into the PRC, then that leaves Japan extremely vulnerable, and it would also undermine their confidence in the US alliance deeply. It would have the same effect across Southeast Asia. So it's a bit of a red line, and it is a very significant point. So getting back to the question about the Quad, though, what we're seeing is each of those players has different vested interests. They want the United States to stay engaged. They're kind of really worried about what China is up to and how it's going to exert pressure, and they figure that there's strength in unity. Now, as I say, we need to be not overly optimistic. We should need to be a little bit cautious about how much we should expect out of the Quad. And I think the Australian Foreign Policy White Paper of 2017 made this clear. It recognised the significance and utility of engaging with India, with Japan and the United States, but also there's a swag of others in between. And of course, most important in there, of course, is the relationship with Indonesia. This is something we've tended to skip over literally and metaphorically on our way to all these other places. But our relationship with Indonesia, our relationship with Southeast Asia, needs to be doubled down upon. And while I agree we should be investing in the Quad, it should not be at the expense of our investment in our immediate neighbourhood in Indonesia, in broader Southeast Asia, in the ASEAN construct, and of course, in the South Pacific.
I've got two questions in my mind. First one would be the military sort of platforms between Japan, India, well, the Quad, and the US and Australia. Are they aligned enough? Are they on the same sort of that they can fight together, practically, for it to be a sort of a military force in its own right? Or are we talking about, Australia, US is obviously aligned militarily, but is India enough aligned? And is Japan enough aligned? And they are sort of signing these agreements now. And then the other part was, we'll come back to the ASEAN nation. Foreign Minister from China has just gone to the Philippines, Myanmar, Brunei, and Indonesia in the last week. And are we doing enough with ASEAN? Are we doing enough in the Pacific as well? We've got the sort of that Papua New Guinea fisheries deal with China as well. So they're really on the doorstep also. So maybe let's just stick with the Quad, and we'll come back to ASEAN and the Pacific. But the Quad as a military sort of arrangement, is there enough there, or is that a good opportunity as well for Australia and India to sort of align together more? Because historically, India has been sort of using Russian platforms and Russian planes and the like. So, what's your play on that, and how much change needs to take place?
So there is growing interoperability, particularly through the acquisition of American surveillance platform that is making P8 Poseidons in particular and others, that is making cooperation and interoperability easier. Of course, Japan is already pretty interoperable because of the operating US standards, communication systems and protocols. But it's quite easy for Australia to work closely with Japan, and the Malabar activities and related Quad activities are pointing to need and the opportunity for Australia to explore issues of interoperability with India beyond those which we've already established with Japan and the United States. I'd caution against thinking too much about the military dimension of this because I would put to you that China is actually looking, while it's furiously building its military capability, building the size of the French Navy every year, from what I understand, they're going
gangbusters. Yeah.
Which is a sobering note for the rest of us, which really does mean we need to be doubling down as well, because for deterrence to work, it has to be credible, and for it to be credible, it has to be something that can cause commensurate pain, inflict commensurate pain on an adversary that might want to inflict pain on us. But as we think about how China might want to do that, it's already doing that in ways that are below that kinetic threshold. That threshold of what we think of as war is not what they think of as war. And so what we're seeing is the attack in the cyber domain with foreign political interference, with the level of industrial espionage and industrial pre-sabotage activity, I think you could call it, is really deeply disconcerting and points to a space that we in Australia and by and large in Western countries are not equipped to handle properly. We're open liberal democracies where what we do is contested and contestable, and therefore operating in a way that we're just not in a position to operate the way China does in terms of cyber attack, in terms of plausibly deniable offensive action, the kinds of actions that are conducted in the South China Sea routinely against the Malaysians, the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, and others by the so-called maritime law enforcement elements of the Chinese state. So what we need to not just think about hard power in terms of grey ships, tanks, and fighter aircraft. We need to be thinking about the cyber domain, about that twilight zone, that grey zone of use of state power to coerce politically and economically neighbours and adversaries to comply with China's wishes. We've seen it in the last few weeks over trade sanctions. Now, I think it's pretty well backfiring because, as you and I both know, Chris, it's economics 101. It's not rocket science that if you stop buying coal from someone and they buy it from someone else, well, that other supplier who was going to supply another market leaves the market open for Australian coal. So, I mean, there's a dynamic equilibrium in global trade that means that, I think China's cutting off its nose to spite its face, to be honest. It's damaging its credibility. It's not actually making progress in terms of really hurting Australia. And the other thing it's doing, it's getting our backs up. No self-respecting Australian is now going to say, let's just bow to China. Let's give in on those demands. Let's do what they ask. It's just not going to happen. Why? Because no self-respecting citizen of any country would want to do that. China's not going to do it to the United States. They demand it of us. We're not going to do it. No one is. So we've got an interesting dynamic at play. It's far short of kinetic war, and it's very active. I'm not saying it's effective, but it's active in this space. Cyber attacks, trade sanctions, foreign political interference, information, manipulation, while at the same time maintaining their own so-called Great Firewall, the Great Firewall of China that precludes us doing to them what they do to us.
Maybe, and I agree with all of that. And it's, again, when you start to look out to that 5 to 10 year time frame, I think that's where it sort of gets a little bit concerning, because how long can this go on for? That tension just feels like it's just building up. I think you're right. In the short term, Australia needs to hold its ground, but ultimately how sort of big in the region will China get, and how much, and this brings us back down to ASEAN now, how much control will China have across the ASEAN region and with some of the key ASEAN countries? I always ask the question, do you think Australia's doing enough with ASEAN? We had a summit here a few years ago, the ASEAN Australian Summit. I try to keep up with those sort of relationships, but you've got 10 nations there, and individually they're all sort of doing their own thing as well as the ASEAN approach. So what are your thoughts on ASEAN, and is Australia doing enough?
So Australia needs to double down on what it's doing. It has ramped up already what it has been doing with ASEAN. But let's not forget what's already happened and what is underway. Australia's just signed a strategic partnership with Thailand. Really, that's surprising, because most people think that Thailand's already been bought out by China. It's not true. Thailand is an independent nation that wants to find its own space. And it looks at Australia, another US treaty ally, under similar pressure from China, and thinking, we should partner with them and explore opportunities to collaborate as best we can on issues of relevance to each other. This is happening across Southeast Asia. Australia-Indonesia relationship is as good as it's ever been.
Yep.
And this is partly because we're seeing a considerable confluence of interests. Our interests are overlapping with theirs in a way we hadn't envisaged a few years ago. And President Jokowi and his government have been looking to collaborate with Australia in a way that has been pleasantly surprising. And I think that it goes across Southeast Asia. But what you won't find them is declaring publicly, we're for Australia, or we're for the US.
Yep.
We're not for. It's much more subtle than that. It's much more complicated than that.
What's your advice to business and trade? Because I get it with the diplomacy of governments and doing things behind the scenes. But sometimes if they're not sort of coming out and saying, we're doing this and we're doing that, business can get frustrated. And I think I get a sense from business here in Australia as well of, are we doing enough of that diplomacy for trade? Any gaps there that you're seeing, and how critical that is to bring the business community along for the ride as well?
Yeah, now this is, I think, where Australia can actually make a difference. The Australian government, through Austrade and through its diplomatic presence in countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, in South Asia and elsewhere, in Africa as well, we can, and in the Pacific, we can be doubling down on opportunities for Australian businesses. And look, it's been relatively easy for Australia in the last few years. So last 2 decades, all you needed was one kind of escort and a translator, interpreter to go with you to Shanghai and various other cities around China, stitch up a few deals and export. Off you go. You're selling wine, wool, beef, barley, you name it. It was happening. Southeast Asia, other markets are smaller, but when you aggregate them, you realise that they're actually just as potentially lucrative. But they're a little bit harder. They're harder work because you've got different cultures, you've got different languages, you've got different legal constraints and constructs. But what we have seen Australia do in the last few years is we've got the Australia ASEAN New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, ANZSAR. We've joined up with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. We're part of the TTG Plus. Never quite
anything. But that's part of the battle, is keeping up with these and finding from a business perspective where you fit in as well.
The point is that it's been easy up until now because we've just focused on China, and we haven't really invested to the appropriate level in Indonesia and across Southeast Asia and South Asia. And this is, I think, what we're realising now. And is it Ken Willett who just said in the press today, was just saying, making this point, we need to diversify. This is fundamentally important to Australia. We have placed too many eggs in one basket. We have the capability to diversify. And there's another parallel experience that's worth reflecting on for a moment, Chris. Back in 1973, the Brits joined the European Economic Community. Australia, and particularly New Zealand, were really hit by the changing trade rules that resulted in us losing out considerably on our markets. But look where we've come since then. We thought that was a terrible moment, a terrible blow, but Australia is a much more prosperous, successful, wealthy and inclusive and expansive country than it was 40 years ago. So, it's not the end of the world if things get a little bit tricky in our markets with China. Bottom line is the global markets are expanding. There are trade opportunities all over the place. Australian goods are in demand. Stuff is good. It's of high quality. People want it, and they'll pay the market price for it. Same goes with education. As long as we let people come back in, Australian education is top notch. It's extremely good value, and people recognise that. But we have an issue, of course, at the moment with state governments not allowing state students in. I think we need to really rethink that, work out a scheme to let students in to revitalise our tertiary industry, if you like.
I think this is where, again, I was sort of moving towards that strategic outlook, and it's something that Rory Metcalf has raised, and we've spoken about it before in terms of a national, a national resilience strategy. Rory's raised a national interest strategy, and Jim Molan has raised a sort of a national security strategy. China's got a military civil strategy where they're bringing that sort of defence, and I see it as risk and opportunity strategic approach, because you talked about all of those good things, the trade opportunities and the like, and then we've also got sort of that defence strategy as well. And rather than doing them individually, we should be doing them possibly together as well. Your thoughts on where we fit with that and how much we should be working with allies in the region? You talked about the Pacific Islands and ASEAN. Is America doing enough there? Are we working closely enough with the US there to counter those resources to engage?
Yeah, so the several questions there, Chris. I'll try and unpack
as I normally do.
Yeah. Essentially, democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others, as Winston Churchill said. And we're caught up with the tyranny of the urgent and the political cycle. It's very hard to look beyond the next election, let alone the next news cycle. And we actually need to rise our vision above and beyond that and look holistically at the spectrum of challenges. So Rory's right, Jim Molan's right, John Blackburn's right. These people who are talking about resilience, about engaging with holistically to address the challenges we as a nation face, it's got to be done not just for the next elections, not even for the ones after that, but for the sake of our kids and our grandkids. So we need to be looking 50 years out and holistically looking at what I call in the geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, the internal strengths and weaknesses and the external opportunities and threats. When you do that, when you look at those holistically, you see that we have a lot of great strengths still, but we have considerable threats, considerable challenges, and the opportunities are also great. But to grasp them, we need to be thinking about in a visionary way about positioning Australia for the future with what I think it needs to be done, a grand compact for the Pacific, offering a deal, too good to refuse for the micro states of the Pacific to come into a compact with Australia akin to what New Zealand's done with Cook Island and Niue, and the United States has done with Palau and the Federated States of Micronesia. Similarly, these ideas about a national security strategy, about thinking about the picture. This is, I think, something that we need some kind of body to do that. I think what I propose is a National Institute for Net Assessment, a National Resilience Institute, whatever you want to call it, but I think that one works, a National Institute for Net Assessment, to holistically scan, survey the challenges we face, the capabilities with the resources we have, the opportunities and the pitfalls that we need to avoid for the sake of our grandchildren.
Yep.
And so this is about not just great power contestation. It is about a spectrum of governance challenges, but it's also about the looming environmental catastrophe. And this is one that it's very interesting to see what the Biden administration is going to do in this space, because we know that he is appointing people with credentials in this space. Kurt Campbell is one of them, who's written about a looming environmental catastrophe. And it's very interesting, Chris, American pressure from the Biden administration may well be the catalyst for Australia's the Morrison government to get over its phobia of environmentalism and actually grasp it as an opportunity rather than as a crisis. As an opportunity for Australia to rise above the small thinking. The Pacific Step Up was in the right direction, but it was hobbled by the criticisms over Australia's environmental strategy. We should be absolutely flipping that and engaging constructively with our neighbours, saying, let's work on this together. Let's follow up on what Biden is thinking and doing, and let's do something in our neighbourhood that constructively looks to map out a plan for the future that's going to see us in a planet that's still going to be worth living on 50 years from now, and that your islands in the Pacific are going to be either safe, or at least you're going to have a safe alternative by living with us in Australia, and that we work to address the governance issues and the issues of management of the space that they live in, the exclusive economic zones, which are under enormous pressure at the moment, not just because of environmental challenges, but because of great demand from states across Northeast Asia. And it's not just China, a lot of them are doing it, but China is obviously the biggest actor here.
Yeah.
In challenging the fisheries, the exclusive economic zones of these microstates, which is fundamental to their future well-being and to our future security.
I think it's a big task, because the moment you start talking about that high-level visionary and you start looking out, climate change is definitely sort of there as well as something that to be dealt with, but also it's going to sort of influence how things turn out into the future as well. The Pacific predominantly. One thing we haven't touched on, and sort of just I want to at least say that we've mentioned it, is North Korea and what sort of Trump did with North Korea, which was slightly off this strategic approach that they had, and sort of what North Korea, how much of a play North Korea, are they a bit of a wild card still, or is it going to be the same old sort of story with North Korea, and we just have to deal with them as they pop up and with their ballistic missiles every now and again?
So I think it's very interesting. The inauguration of President Biden provides a unique opportunity, because the government of North Korea is facing calamity. The closure of its borders with China, in part through the consequence of the pandemic, have, from reports that I've read, generated an economic crisis. Kim Jong-un argued that the creation of the nuclear arsenal was then going to be the precursor to them investing in economic prosperity, because they were going to be able to safeguard the nation. Well, of course, that's not materializing, and it is presenting him with a challenge, because he's staked a lot of his credibility on that economic development. So there's an opportunity here, I think, for the Biden administration to start afresh and actually present a bit of a different proposal than what President Trump has suggested over the last couple of years, but starting out on a much lower key to explore opportunities to engage constructively to break through the impasse with North Korea. Now, of course, we know that Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, is very enthusiastic for reunification, and Biden may well help facilitate that. But, whenever there's a transition, it's always fraught. And as you start to change the dynamics, as you shift to the power balance, say if you start withdrawing America's footprint from South Korea, it's at those junctures that things can really turn pear-shaped. So whatever happens here will require deft management by the likes of Kurt Campbell. But thankfully, Joe Biden's a very seasoned a veteran of American foreign policy himself. He's been, he was a vice president under Obama for 8 years. Critics can say, look, he's going to be like Obama. He's able to learn from all of that experience, the mistakes, the pitfalls, and of course the mistakes and pitfalls of the Trump administration. He's got a wealth of experience and knowledge and insight, and he is hoping he can capitalize on that and bring about some peaceful transition that will see a de-escalation there and an opening up as well.
Look, fingers crossed on all of that. I still come into this space with a sort of a pessimistic lens. I tweeted the other day after reading an article, and it's like, yeah, no, sorry, there's too many things going to go wrong just on what we've touched on in 40 minutes, John. So look, we'll leave it there. We didn't touch on the pandemic. We had you on for a podcast sort of, I think, around March last year. We'll see how we go. I think maybe from the investigation that they're doing in Wuhan at the moment, and see how that sort of comes out, and we'll have you back and some commentary on that, I think. And also, I have reached out to Rory Metcalf to talk about sort of the sort of national resilience strategy. And in fact, I'd love to have you, Rory, and Jim Molan lined up together and see how you guys are thinking in that space from that strategy viewpoint.
Well, I think you'll find that we're using slightly different words, but conceptually we're in parallel.
I agree. I think, yeah, you're all coming in it from a unique perspective, but absolutely, I think you're all talking the same thing, and I'd advocate for something like that as well. But again, I'm pessimistic. It's probably not going to happen. Look, Professor John Blaxland, you're there with the Australian National University. Let me just, as I finish off, we're going to bring Philippe on now, but I had a few more slides. For those of who just may not have, let me just get that going. This is some takeaways out of the strategy. This is obviously a printed document, right? The typeset looks like they typed this up on a typewriter. I was looking at it, so it's not that sophisticated. But their top interest, it's quite a simple, high-level document in terms of its way it's set out, but quite high level, quite a focus on China there. And the take there, that bottom one, China will take increasingly assertive steps to compel the unification with Taiwan. There's a few other bits. It is a redacted document, but not too much. And certainly the Quad is brought up quite predominantly. So look, Professor John Blaxland, thank you so much for your time. You've been extremely courteous with your time on getting this episode up. So thank you so much. I'll put you backstage. Unless you want to stay on, you're welcome to stay on with Philippe. I'll have you on backstage. If you stay on there and want to raise your hand and got a question, you're welcome to. But I'll let you go and enjoy your day.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
And Philippe, let me just bring up, I've got a slide here. Oh, no, I don't. Hang on. Let me go back. Let me just go back and bring up so we can introduce you properly. Ah, there you are. Philippe Odouard, am I saying that correctly?
It's actually Odouard. It's ARD, not RAD, but anyway, that's fine.
Oh, ARD.
ARD, yeah. You're the first, you won't be the last anyway.
I better check my email, whether I typed that or cut and paste it. But you're the Managing Director for XTEK. Thank you so much for your time. This came in, I think, late last year. You signed a memorandum of understanding with Milram Robotics. Maybe introduce yourself and what XTEK is doing. You're a listed company. And yeah, we'll dive into your unmanned ground vehicles and robotic technology.
Okay, well, thank you and good morning, Chris. Thank you very much for having me today. Yes, XTEK is a listed company. We have a turnover of about $40 million. We've been profitable. We specialize in frontline soldier equipment systems in general, which is, we've been doing for the last 30 years or so. I mean, we're not new on the market at all. But it's typically an area that is a bit underdeveloped to a large extent. The frontline soldier is typically has his own helmet and weapon, and is a sort of an autonomous thing, and it hasn't been very helped by technology or systems in general terms. So that's what it's all about. So the company specializes in that. We have a big activity in armor. We have developed our own technology, which is a lot lighter, and we're selling it worldwide. We've actually acquired a company in the US to sort of help us do that just about a year ago, and that is going very, very strongly. But the other activity that we have in this is a C4ISR, if you're familiar with the word, which is which basically where we have a line of products that are typically very much based on autonomous systems. So we've been selling UAV system, unmanned aerial vehicle systems. We signed a $40 million contract with the Australian Army, and we have another one about the same value for its maintenance for a 1.3 kilo UAV that has an endurance of about 45 minutes. That is really, very much in the hands of the frontline soldier.
You're manufacturing that?
Sorry, no, we don't manufacture that.
You're reselling, okay, got it.
We're selling it, but when you see the picture that you have on your in the background here, we're talking much smaller.
Your 1 kilo, 1.3 is pretty. Are they throwing that, or is it?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
They're thrown, and but they give you a very, very good picture, and they give you a real-time thing. it's actually very well protected against jamming and so on. So it's a really a military product. It's not the sort of DJI thing that you find for $1,000 on the market.
Is it fixed wing?
Sorry?
Fixed wing or quad rotor like what?
No, fixed wings. It's fixed.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But fixed wings give you a much more silent product and a much more endurance for the same weight, basically.
Yeah.
So so we have that activity. We've made EOD robots, explosive and ordnance disposal robots now. We don't make them, we sell them for the last 30 years or so. So we've been in UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, for quite some time. But at the end of the day, that kind of activity where it's the help to the soldier is developed on one side, the big companies are tending to sort of focus on the manned platforms, aircraft or tanks or these kinds of things, which we can't compete in, we're just too small.
Yeah.
But in terms of unmanned vehicles, UGV and UAVs, they are very well, very much in the sort of area that we can really make a difference. And particularly in terms of the integration of data coming from those different platforms, and we've developed our own set of softwares and systems that actually bring together the data coming from UAVs and soon from UGVs to sort of give the picture to the combatant, the frontline combatant, not the headquarters, but the frontline combatants, to help him do its job, basically.
Right.
And so that's really the strategy that we've had. So we've been, we are in an area where we can compete against the big guys, the Boeings and the Lockheed Martin and others. It's something that we can do. We have a lot of expertise. We've been in that area for years and years. And there is a very strong support from the government in that sense to sort of use the local industry to be able to sort of provide those kinds of capabilities. There is a lot of money that we've have access to develop new products and new systems. There is a demand, a real opportunity for the government to buy or the army to buy these kinds of products out of Australia, not necessarily anything done overseas is better, which is has been the mantra very much in this country for a long time. And so really the whole thing is actually very positive as an environment. So which leads me to why we signed that contract with Milram. Milram is a more of a generic platform in terms of UGV. This one weighs about 750 kilos. It's reasonably big. You can carry, say, a couple of people, casualties, for instance. You can actually put a remote weapon station on top to sort of fight something. You can put different weapons on top, and it's something that very much together with a UAV, you can actually get data from the UAV, process that data, and that's what our system, our software does, and then pass it on to a weapon on the UGV, or sort of integrate all this in the battlefield at the combatant level. So that's really part of the puzzle that we propose, which is something that we understand because we've been dealing with EOD robots, explosive and ordnance robots, for years, but also because we can integrate that picture into a global combatant picture at the soldier level.
And are they on the same platform, or they're the platforms that are integrating in terms of a command? So from a sort of drone control, you can start to control a drone and a ground vehicle on the same platform at the same time, or are you doing it separately?
You probably, well, I mean, that is a really good question, because you may have lots of those platforms onto a battlefield. So one of the key challenge is to be able to use as much autonomous systems as possible, as much of an artificial intelligence approach to it, to sort of reduce the cognitive load that comes on the soldier, and for a soldier to be able to manage several platforms. Possibly more and more you get to common remote control stations, basically, which can drive an aircraft, a UAV and a UGV. All these are concepts that we are gradually going forward with. That being said, at the present time, you normally have a decent number of operators. The whole question is how you coordinate all this, and that's where the system approach that we have is coming in.
You're doing a lot. You mentioned the Australian defence. You're doing a bit with US defence as well, right?
We're doing, sorry?
You're doing work with the US defence as well?
Yes, very much so. I mean, we have a subsidiary in the US. They make about $13 million of turnover, so it's a reasonably large company. We've got about 60 people over there. They specialize really in armor, but of course that's an area where we can diversify into other things, of course, from there. So they're based in Columbus, Ohio, which is a highly industrialized area. And of course, it's if you want to sell to the US, you need to be have a presence, and we have more than a selling presence. We have an industrial presence. We manufacture there, so we have that credibility and capacity to sort of respond to the US demand. Which, as you know, there is a thing called the Berry Amendment that forces you to sort of produce in the US for things that would be sold mainly to defense.
And what about else in the region as well? Any other opportunities for you as an Australian sort of defence supplier? What are you saying in the region?
No, we try to go. I mean, on armor, we're really going worldwide. I mean, we have a representative in Europe. We're very focused on Europe and the US, but a fair bit in Southeast Asia. And that the interview you had just before me was of great interest. We certainly have a lot more interest out of countries of the Quad in particular, and countries like Singapore, Indonesia. All these countries have got an interest. That being said, we tend to have our own products are pretty high, top of the range, and so you need to sort of have a bit of money and a valuation of human life that is really important to be able to sell top of the range.
Yep.
So that's why the emphasis is very much in the US and Europe, and we've sold a number of plates to Finland, for instance, which are people that have really got a little problem on their border. So yes, it's very important. On the C4 ISR, we very much interface with a number of drones, and the integration there is there's a high demand for that everywhere. A lot of people are doing drones, and it's in an ultra competitive area. But they don't actually exploit the data coming from those drones or from the UGVs in the same way. They tend to sort of supply raw data to the operator, and then the operator says, what do I do with this? And so what we do is we process that. We sort of say, well, hey, we make 3D models out of what you sort of gather from the drones. For instance, give you an instant picture. We process the data real time, and you get a situation awareness on the battlefield, real time. The photo of the UAV you're showing in the background can do that, but it costs you 65 million to sort of get one aircraft. We can do the same with an investment of less than $1 million.
Where do you see this going? We've covered a lot on sort of drones. We have a drastic news.com channel which covers drones and robotics. So looking at it for many years, but where do you see this in terms of the sort of the military warfighting capabilities of these machines and things like swarming? Malcolm Davis from ASPI talks about fire ant warfare. Do you see it moving in that regards where these machines, for want of a better word, can be mass produced and deployed as part of an attack model? Is that where you're going, or are these more just helping the soldiers and battalions as sort of additional tool sets?
It's a two-pronged approach in that sense. It's a support, it's a help to sort of at the present time, the way you sort of look if you have an enemy that is shooting at you is raise your head above the parapet and risk being killed, and that a lot of people get killed that way. And these guys are heroes to do it because, frankly, it's extremely dangerous. And there's absolutely no reason to do it nowadays. There's enough robots or cameras or things that can give you much better vision at a much lower risk to the soldier. the way we operate in the army here in Australia, in particular, I mean, there's hardly any people, you know, walking exposed in any way, shape, or form. Every time you sort of want to move someone from one place to the other, you put them in an armored vehicle, they get protected, then they get into a sheltered area, and they do their job that way. You try and protect them, you know, massively. So the next step is really, you know, automate and get more and more of these autonomous or
unmanned, basically,
unmanned things, which will, to start with, help, you know, protect them and avoid them being killed, which is important.
Certainly, as a forward force, and even doesn't matter what size you're moving forward. If these both on the ground and in the air, I take it you got maritime vehicles as well, do you?
Well, yes, we do. One of our drone is actually an all environment, meaning you can land on water. So yes, it's very much of a Navy approach. It's also very good for the north of Australia, or the areas we described about half an hour ago, where in the islands at the north of Australia you have typically very dense tropical forest, and it's not very good to sort of land a UAV anywhere. Yeah. Except on the river, which is of course flat, and you have a bit of a vision of what you can do. So yes, it's very much an all service sort of an approach. So the first is to sort of help the guys automate and protect themselves. But as you go, you get more and more of these as fighting vehicles. And we've done a lot of work. We're doing a lot of work at the present time. We just signed a contract called C4 Edge with EOS in Canberra, which is integrating our system between their remote weapon stations that they mount either on UGVs or on Land 400, for instance, platforms, to connect with a UAV, and for the UAV to designate a target.
Yeah,
you know, completely automatically.
Nice. So, an autonomous killing machine, right?
That's right. And so the more we'll go, the more you'll find AI integrated into this, more and more decisions made by the machine. Will still have, you know, people pressing the button at the end of the day.
It's also that communication, that connectivity, even if it's not completely autonomous, if it's remotely controlled with a secure communication channel, probably via satellite as well. You can do it anywhere in the world.
And as the cost of those are going down, because you know, we're talking you know, very capable but much smaller things and cheaper one too. That means that you can multiply them and get, you know, swarms of things. And we're very much as well in the space area where the satellites are getting smaller and smaller, and there again you don't need a big multinational to sort of be able to interact, and we have some products in that area that we've announced recently. So it's very much it's going in that direction where you have a lot more support to the soldier, a lot less casualties, and a lot more of quantities basically of these things, you know, interacting in the battlefield and doing things, you know, in a much more effective way.
Very interesting. Finally, you are focused on defence. I take it you're not doing sort of civil security applications as well?
Quite a lot less. In the US, for instance, our specialty is more the law enforcement side of things. The market for law enforcement in the US is about the same size as the military. We do a fair bit with the police here in Australia across the board. So yes, the full civilian aspect probably less. There's less money available, and they're not prepared to sort of put a lot of money to sort of automate those kinds of things yet. But it's going to come. I mean, you know, no doubt about that. It's the demand is actually coming up on the commercial side as well.
Great. Look, thank you so much for your time, Philippe. And apologies, I'll get your spelling right on the edited version in the show notes. We'll have a link to XTEK and an announcement on our Drastic News channel. But thank you so much. And we do cover space and defence as well. We've got a new website up about to go live in the next week or two. So hopefully we'll have you on again, and I'll keep in up to date on XTEK and I'll put you on my watch list on the market as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Lots of things happening. Thank you very much for your time, Chris, and your interest.
Thank you very much. All the best. Thank Thank you. Well, look, on that note, John, thank you so much for staying around in the background there. Philippe, thank you very much for your time. And I think I'm going to close it off. We were sort of hanging around a little bit for Zach Cooper in Washington with the American Enterprise Institute, but I'll have Zach on. We'll make a time with him and get his analysis on the Asian region as well. So look, thank you so much for joining us on My Security TV. We'll be back on Friday. Let me go through these slides. Let me just run through those. The report of the week, report of the day, the Secure and Onyx threat research came out with how to be responding to the SolarWinds, Sunburst, and Eclipse supply chain attacks. About 18,000 plus customers of SolarWinds believed to have been exposed there. This has been going on for some time. But again, all the announcements now coming out on how to respond to these attacks. Otherwise, in Australia, you can go to cyber.gov.au as well. There was a high alert, I think, late last week on this as well. So check it out. Otherwise, this is on the marketplace to download from Secure Onyx Threat Research. That's pretty much it. On Friday, we're going back down to Canberra. We've got John Carabin, Director of Cybersecurity for NTT Australia, and looking at their digital forensics and incident response, and their monthly threat report looked at the endpoint device evasive attack stages. So we'll walk through that report, catch up with John and what NTT Australia is doing as well. So a little bit more of cybersecurity focus. And then Tuesday week, next week is Australia Day. The following week, we're visiting the University of Sydney and with a session with Professor James Rabau, and looking at semiconductors and their global supply chain, and also their study on the Australian market in semiconductors. So that's where we're heading. That's it for us. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you on Friday.